Charles Ponzi, the biggest scammer the world has ever known. Born in Parma, Italy, Ponzi left his home to restore his family's fortune. But who knew his quest would turn into a mastermind plan that would rob billionaires? He said he went to find trouble, and he found it. He dealt with millions of dollars coming from people begging to take their money because he had become the godfather of the get-rich-quick scheme. But little did they know that it was all a heinous scam. Charles Ponzi brought people from riches to rags, while his pockets were filled with people's hard-earned money. His methods are so shocking yet ingenious that today, his scheme secures a definition in dictionaries worldwide. Charles Ponzi was born in a relatively financially secure family of northern Italy. But their familial wealth had started to run dry by the time Ponzi was born. Thinking that he was too good for anything, Ponzi struggled with education. He got admitted to University of Rome La Sapienza, but he took it as a 4-year vacation. He lived beyond what he was capable of, indulging in luxuries with his rich elite friends. He was eventually left broke and without a degree and had nowhere to turn to. There had been stories of people who moved to America and had become rich and successful. Ponzi believed this to be his calling, and so with ambitions and dreams to make it big, he boarded a ship that led him to Boston, America.
With only $2.50 in his pocket, with the rest gambled away on the voyage, Ponzi arrived in Boston. With nowhere to go, Ponzi started to look for jobs. He found himself doing odd jobs as a grocery clerk, factory hand, dishwasher, sewing machine repairman, nurse, insurance salesman, and sign painter, but was fired from each job due to his incessant need to trick and rob the people he worked for. Though enraging at the start, it was his fraudster nature, which would soon become the factor of his fame and would eventually get him the title of the biggest scammer in the world. Disappointed by his lack of success so far, Ponzi moved to Montreal, Canada in 1907. He was now well-versed in English, Italian, and French, which helped him secure a job at a newly opened bank, Banco Zarossi. Though this wasn't an odd job anymore, this too didn't last very long because his boss was a scammer himself. He was using the infamous fraud of robbing Peter to pay Paul, which is basically a centuries-old method in which he was using money from his new investors to pay his older ones. As a result, Zarossi was able to get an interest of 6%, which was double of what it was at that time. Working dutifully under the con artist, Ponzi eventually rose to bank manager. At this position, he noticed that the bank was in deep financial turmoil. It was due to some really bad real estate loans that Zarossi had taken, and also because he was funding the interest payments not through profit on investments, but by using money deposited in newly opened accounts. As expected, the bank eventually failed, and Zarossi fled to Mexico with large sums of money that he had managed to extract from the bank. Ponzi stayed back in Montreal and helped Zarossi's abandoned family. With no money and no idea where to go next, Ponzi found himself in one of Zarossi's former customer offices of Canadian warehousing. Much to his dismay, he didn't find anyone there, but he did find an empty checkbook. He wrote himself a check of $428.53 and forged the signature of the owner. He was soon caught red-handed with the forged check and eventually ended up in prison, sentenced for 3 years. After his release in 1911, Ponzi still didn't learn the lesson and soon got involved in a scheme which smuggled Italian immigrants across the border. He was caught again and once more went to prison, where he befriended a wealthy Wall Street businessman who gave him insights about the financial world that became Ponzi's education for successful frauds in the future.
With a lot of business ideas in his head, Ponzi was finally released from prison. In order to look for jobs, he moved from city to city, trying to find a stable and suitable job. After more than a decade, Ponzi found himself back in Boston. Life became kinder to him when he finally found a decent job as a clerk at the JR Pool Company. Not only a good job, he also met a girl, Rose Ginecco. Even though Ponzi didn't tell Rose about his prison sentences, his mother wrote her a letter briefing her of his past. Nevertheless, Rose did not bother, and they both got married in 1918. Ponzi was good at his job and had started seeing success by promotions and steady inflow of money. But for Ponzi, this was not enough. Even though Rose was not fond of a fancy life, Ponzi insisted that he wanted to spoil her with riches. Consequently, Ponzi quit his job as a clerk and started to look for something else to do, in hopes that he could be wealthier and live a more luxurious life than a normal clerk job can offer him. To try his luck further, Ponzi went on to work in his father-in-law's wholesale fruit selling company. However, he could not showcase his financial geniusness at this instant, and the business ended up failing, and it filed for bankruptcy. Unhinged about his recurrent failures, Ponzi tried to be even more bold in his endeavors and went on to set up his own business in import-export, but he had overestimated his skills and assets. He didn't have any contacts to import any serious businesses, but Ponzi refused to give up. He remained under the judgment cloud that he just needed to advertise some more and he will be able to succeed. But even that had failed, but this failure gave birth to another idea. Giving up was not in Ponzi's dictionary. When he noticed how much money goes into advertising, he decided he will launch his own trade magazine. According to his calculations, Ponzi was planning on making an $80,000 profit from the money the traders would pay him to be featured in the magazine. To put this plan in motion, Ponzi rented a much larger place and hired people to work for him. And he began his operation by beginning to write to investors and business owners to advertise through his first ever traders issue. But little did he know that his apparent master plan was doomed to fail too, as he had no experience in the field. He could not sell his advertising plan to people who wanted to advertise. Business just weren't interested, nor in his idea or his offer, and certainly did not want to pay the hefty amounts that he demanded. Once more, Ponzi found himself slumped under debt and loan. With his plan going down the drain, Ponzi had become bankrupt. He needed money to stay afloat, and for that Ponzi began going from one bank to another seeking loans. But no bank was convinced enough to give him a loan. In fact, the banks told him that they would rather close his accounts altogether instead of giving him even $1. Disappointed, but determined to still make it big, Ponzi laid off his workers and gave up the place for rent to make way for a mightier plan. One fine day in August 1919, when Ponzi was going through his mail, he found a letter from Spain inquiring about his trade magazine business. The letter had an international reply coupon attached to it, which enabled Ponzi to find a flaw in the system. This was the breakthrough point for Ponzi. He had cracked the code to fill his pockets with loads of money. IRC worked in a peculiar way. Postal reply coupons allowed people in one country to pay for return postage from someone in another country. They were bought for the local postage price and could be traded for stamps in the other country to cover the return postage. If postage rates were different between the two countries, it was possible to make a profit. Luckily for Ponzi, inflation after World War I, the postage could be bought much cheaper in Italy and sold at a higher price in the US. Though on a small level, the profit would only be tiny, but with millions of IRCs in a much higher scale, Ponzi could be making big money. According to Ponzi's calculations, he was about to make around 400% of profit from this little glitch that he had hacked in the mailing system. This is called the system of arbitrage, and Ponzi had had the opportunity to learn about it years ago when he had been working with Zorossi. The only difference, however, was that while Zorossi was dealing in people's investment into businesses, while Ponzi was making use of the inflation in the countries. Even though this form of arbitrage wasn't originally Ponzi's scheme, but he did perfect it. So in January 1920, Ponzi began working towards what seemed the most viable business idea yet. He called it the Securities Exchange Company. To raise money, he went to several of his friends in Boston and promised that he would double their investment in 90 days, and that too in an environment where banks were paying only 5% annual interest. He explained to them that the great returns from postal reply coupons made incredible profits that are easy to accomplish. In the first month of his company being launched, 18 people invested in his company with a total of $1,800. He paid them promptly the very next month with money obtained from a newer set of investors. As a result, Ponzi set up a bigger office. Word spread and investments started to grow. Ponzi increased his workforce and hired agents to get more investors. Ponzi began depositing money in the Hanover Trust Bank of Boston. His ambition was to amass a large enough account to exert influence over the bank, or even become its president after he deposited $3 million in the bank, along with other investments brought in by his friends. By July 1920, Ponzi had accumulated millions of dollars. Many of his investors were mortgaging their homes and investing their life savings. Instead of taking their profits, most chose to reinvest. Ponzi's company expanded rapidly, setting up branches from Maine to New Jersey. Despite the impressive daily cash influx, a basic financial analysis would have revealed that Ponzi's operation was running at a significant loss. Ponzi had found himself in the centuries-old scheme of rob Peter to pay Paul, which became the famous Ponzi scheme. But because his arbitrage IRC scheme sounded very good, he continued to mask the real deal with it. This scheme demanded people to invest in businesses with the promise of quick and hefty returns. In reality, however, the money is never really being invested. A large chunk of money goes in the pocket of the fraudster, and some of it goes into paying the earlier investors who get excited by the large sum of returns. They, in turn, tell other people about this foolproof investment, but really what is happening is that the new investors are paying the early investors while their money isn't being invested anywhere at all. It was a very simple but quite effective scheme which basically played on people's lack of financial education and greed to get more money.
As a result, Ponzi had started to live the life he had always dreamed of. He got himself a luxurious lifestyle with expensive cars, prestigious cigars. He went to parties with the rich and indulged in activities of the elite. Big investors were still skeptical about Ponzi's scheme, but those weren't the people that Ponzi was aiming towards. The people who got on board with his scam were people eager for the get-rich-quick scheme and had little to none financial literacy, thus would have minimal chance to crack the code to his scheme. But because of his imminent success and reliable returns, he did become the talk of the town, and soon he became the subject of scrutiny. When a Boston financial writer suggested there was no way Ponzi could legally deliver such high returns in a short period of time, Ponzi sued him for libel and won $500,000 in damages. And because the earlier investors were being paid, people had reason to believe that Ponzi's scheme was legitimate. However, the Boston Post, that usually would write in praise of Ponzi, now started to investigate what he was doing. They brought in Clarence Barron, the president of Dow Jones and manager of the Wall Street Journal, who quickly spotted the very obvious fraud that Ponzi was ensuing. He spotted that though Ponzi was still paying back investors, mostly from money from subsequent investors, he had not yet figured out a way to actually change the IRCs to cash. For example, for the initial 18 investors of January 1920 for their $1,800 investment, it would have taken 53,000 postal coupons to actually realize the arbitrage profits. For the subsequent 15,000 investors that Ponzi had, he would have had to fill Titanic-sized ships with postal coupons just to ship them to the US from Europe. Consequently, in July 1920, the Boston Post released the front-page news that Ponzi was nothing but a liar. But still, Ponzi wasn't yet considered a scammer because he cooperated with the government and also agreed not to take more investments until he was legally allowed to. All was under control until he made the mistake of hiring William McMasters. McMasters was an honest publicist who soon realized that his client was an utter and complete fraud. He began investigating each of his moves, and with the benefit of him being on the inside, he was able to gather enough intel to support his claims. With the evidence he gathered, McMasters wrote a Pulitzer Prize-winning expose that shared all of Ponzi's scam. He wrote that Ponzi is a financial idiot. He sits with his feet up on the table, smoking expensive cigars and speaking gibberish about stamps. And now the game is totally over. Several banks had to file bankruptcy while investors lost their lifelong savings. But the con man was able to strike a deal and pleaded guilty to only a single charge of mail fraud and was sentenced to only 5 years of federal prison, which was relatively a smaller punishment for the amount of money stolen and lives ruined.
Ponzi managed to get out after only 3.5 years in prison. And you'd imagine that he would be a changed man, having learned his lesson, but he really wasn't. He immediately began to restart his scheme, but now he went to Florida to do that. He asked investors to pay him large funds of money that he would invest in real estate. In reality, the land he was asking them to invest in was a worthless slum that had no hopes of ever increasing in its worth. He hardly got any investors. He was quickly outsmarted by people who did a little research on him, and found articles on his fraud. Fearing that he would end up in prison again, he attempted to run away to Italy disguised as a sailor, but he was soon recognized and Ponzi ended up again in prison, and this time for 7 years. He went to President Calvin Coolidge, asking for mercy, and even Benito Mussolini, but of course no one really listened. When he came out of the prison, he was a different man. He was broken and depressed. His wife had left him after he got deported to Italy, where his family had completely abandoned him. Ponzi lived the rest of his life in poverty, where he only had his memories of the golden days. And in 1941, a heart attack left him considerably weakened. His eyesight began failing, and by 1948, he was almost completely blind. Ponzi died in a charity hospital in Rio de Janeiro on January 18, 1949. Even though Charles Ponzi is one of the biggest scammers the world has seen, people often argue if he was extremely smart or just a really dumb person who got lucky. His hunger for success drove him to his doom. Do you think that what Ponzi did was justified? Or are rags to riches just a myth? Comment your thoughts and don't forget to subscribe to our channel.